All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I know some people are going to join us in a little bit, but I'm Alan Jagolinzer. I play multiple roles at the Cambridge Judge Business School. Right now I'm the Vice Dean for Programs. Will slides and recording be shared after this session? The answer is yes. Okay, so we'll do that for sure. I'm the Vice Dean for Programs at the Cambridge Judge Business School. I'm also the Professor of Financial Accounting, and I also am the convener of the Cambridge Disinformation Summit, which we'll talk about probably at the very end of this talk. I've been at Cambridge for about 8 years. Prior to that, I was in Colorado for several years. And then prior to that, I spent 6 years doing corporate governance and financial accounting research at the Stanford Business School, teaching in the MBA program there. And I also was a 2015 fellow at the International Accounting Standards Board. So my research is primarily in financial accounting and governance and disinformation now. So we're going to talk today about systemic information pollution risks, and I'll define stuff as we go through this. And I've done considerable amount of work, particularly over the last 5 years or so, trying to get my handle on information pollution, and I'll break that down into what that means in a little bit and why the work that we do is so incredibly important. And I can't say that loudly enough, and particularly in the kind of world environment that we're operating in right now, it's become even more important. I always start off now with this quote. I think this quote is pretty powerful, and it's going to explain a little bit of the dichotomy of what we're observing in the world right now. So what I mean by dichotomy is that in my field, in my audiences, when I've worked with students, particularly in programs like our Masters of Finance or Executive Masters of Accounting, et cetera, I tend to get students who are skeptical with data. We get reports from corporations, for example, and I tend to not trust them fully until I've done the vetting. And this is why we have an audit function, among other things, why we have regulators and a regulatory process. But then when you move out into the bigger world, into the world of X and Instagram and Facebook and on these online channels in the media, including television and radio and news media, you get into a place where people don't necessarily want to do any vetting of information. And it reminded me of this quote by Maya Angelou, who is a poet and a civil rights activist. And she says, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And we'll come back to that quote in a little bit. But when we get into information, everything we do, every single thing we do has information asymmetry. And often in my field, we only discuss it in the context of deals, like financial deals. We'll see information asymmetry all the time in the context of like lending or buying a car. But it's in every relationship, including some of the ones that matter even arguably more than buying a car. So in our romantic relationships, in our family relationships, in our relationships with friends, even there's information asymmetry. And it's incredibly difficult to understand, at what point are we over trusting, at what point do we over rely on our instincts or something like that? And are they correct? And is there a way that we can actually get better information from our partners so that we don't get hurt? Because in many cases, we're quite vulnerable. When you're on the lacking information side of an information asymmetric relationship. So if I'm the one who really needs more information, then I'm inherently vulnerable. And in a car deal, I'm obviously vulnerable to being cheated or sold something completely terrible. And the same goes sort of in a romantic relationship as another analog. So the whole point of this is to illustrate like the need for clarity and the need for trust in the information. So information is incredibly, incredibly important. And I have a quote on the right that I actually came up with, kind of recently. I think it's an important quote to get your head around. And for me, the accounting profession is one of the biggest societal imperatives we have. And I don't think that's hyperbole. And we as a profession don't communicate it properly. A lot of our students come in and they think accounting is sort of a compliance exercise. There's a bunch of rules that we have to follow, et cetera. And it's much more than that. I mean, we have to have clean information in order to do care in our relationships, and our societies corrode very quickly when we have polluted and contaminated information. This was the impetus for building the Executive Masters of Accounting program at Cambridge. I came over with a colleague, and we built a team because what we wanted to do was we wanted to get out this notion of the power and the need for leadership around clean and quality information, because it's a societal imperative. And so the way I characterize what the EMAC is about is we're trying to bring in people from around the world, because information corrosion is a global problem. And so we're trying to get a global community together to advocate and to run change leadership around information cleanliness and accountability. And we'll discuss why that's so imperative, but we're trying to enhance transparency and accountability. I think it's among the most urgent societal imperatives. And I've been out recently telling publicly that currently in this environment, as of this moment in history, I think we are in an acute global crisis around information quality and accountability. And I think this program has become even more important to societal need globally than ever, because we really have to put our flag in the ground and say, we are not going to surrender high quality information infrastructure. We're not going to just let people lie freely to us, because that's where a lot of harm is done. And we'll talk about that as we move forward. So when I talk about information pollution, I use it as a catch-all, and it usually comes into two terms. And the first one to me is the one I've decided to focus most of my career on, which is disinformation. It's often conflated with another term that I'll define in a moment called misinformation. They are not the same. They're related, but they are not the same. Disinformation is intentional. This is where you have an actor who is intentionally pushing misleading or false narratives through targeted channels to exploit a targeted vulnerable audience. So the whole point of it is that they actually want something out of somebody else, and they're manipulating. It's an intentionally manipulative communication device. I've broken it down into 6 elements. There's reasons I've done that as a framework. First of all, I think it helps clarify a structure on how to think about disinformation and how to spot it. It also helps communicate to somebody who's potentially being misled and being victimized, what they might be seeing and what campaign is happening to them. And it also helps us articulate in the research field who is looking at which piece. So the psychologists are looking, for example, at the first piece, which is the malign actors. Why is somebody trying to manipulate somebody else? They're also looking at piece 5, the targeted vulnerable audience. So why do people believe the information that's coming at them? And I'll do a little bit of explanation based on my reading of their stuff. The accountants are looking often at number 2, which are the incentives. And I'll move into that discussion in a moment too. But I'm skipping around. Basically, the 6 elements are: you have actors who have incentives to craft a narrative through a channel to a targeted vulnerable audience for exploitation. Those are the 6 steps. The incentives that we look at mostly in our field are financial. We've spent a tremendous amount of energy around financial frauds as one example. It's important to know that often these actors are looking for social psychological incentives. I've done a ridiculous amount of reading now into things like malignant narcissism in the psychology literature. I've looked at cult psychology literature. I've looked at theology. I've looked at anthropology, just because I'm trying to understand the humans in this structure. And there are a lot of papers that discuss the need for example, narcissistic supply. It's an incredibly powerful need, apparently, almost some I would characterize as an addictive need. And so the need for affirmation or for retribution might be social psychological incentives. Power is certainly one, and power and finance typically go together. Physical control, physical access. I'll give you a very dark example of that in a moment. And it's important to recognize that the incentives are not mutually exclusive. In fact, many of these go together. You'll often see all of these incentives in play. Another thing to talk about is the dissemination channels. We often focus now on social media. That's an incredibly powerful dissemination channel. I think it's important to think about the targeting. So I'm going to go for the dissemination channel where I know the audience is. So I first identify, what audience am I after? And then I think about where are they and how can I access them? We tend, as I said, to focus almost too much on social media and even particular social media. So right now there's a lot of energy around X as a platform because for good reason. I mean, X has a lot of toxic narrative in there. But it's important to realize that there are so many other channels. AM radio in the United States has been a channel for information. The newspapers have been a channel. And even as importantly, face-to-face communication and word of mouth has been a dissemination channel forever throughout history. And now one of the most powerful dissemination channels are podcasts and also WhatsApp. There's a lot of disinformation pushed through WhatsApp and directly into your feed. So one-on-one actually is a dissemination channel as well. One piece on the targeted vulnerable audience, this gets into micro-targeting. We've placed so much data about ourselves on the internet that one of our colleagues, David Stillwell, who actually teaches in the Cambridge EMAC, he is one of the world's experts on what's called psychometrics. He was one of the first people to work with colleagues to pull, I believe it was 200 data points out of Facebook, your likes, your reposts, what you communicate back to other people's chats, what you place into a chat or into a Facebook post. And he said with 200 data points, he could pinpoint your personality profile as precisely as somebody you've married. So reflect on that for a moment. You have a life partner, you've been with them tens, dozens of years. And with 200 posts on Facebook, I can pretty much be as accurate about who you are as a human being, what you like, what you hate, who you hate, whether you have any biases, whether you're racist, whether I can trigger it. But fundamentally, with that data, I know what to trigger. I know how to get you angry. I know how to get you laughing. I know how to get you to spread beyond it. So if I send something to you, you might go, oh, this is funny. I'm going to share it. So the targeted vulnerable audience piece, the sophisticated, we have a lot of sophistication around how to target information to those audiences. Examples in my field, it's fraud. I mean, Bernie Madoff, Theranos, Wirecard, on and on and on. I mean, this is running this disinformation structure. I also noticed too, one of the reasons I came up with the structure and said that accounting is inherently in the disinformation space is because it shares the same structure as predatory sexual offenders too. This gentleman was a doctor who was working with gymnasts, female gymnasts, particularly in the United States. These were mostly Olympic gymnasts and university gymnast athletes. And he was providing false incentives to the parents, to the coaches, to the university, and to the victims about his healthcare regime, healthcare in quotes. And he was able to victimize that way. And it also runs through authoritarian enterprises, which we call mafia states. And we'll discuss what those are in a minute. I'm going to pause and take a look at the questions. So Georgie was asking a question specifically about Enron using mark-to-market accounting and the Ponzi scheme. So the answer is it's a more complicated than that. Enron definitely did use mark-to-market and Madoff. There are so many different ways, Georgia, that you can run disinformation in a financial reporting context. I'm not going to drill down to all of them in this particular discussion, but we could easily, I've spent a lot of time and I know many people who have mapped out so many different strategies that one could deploy to manipulate the financial reports of an entity and to try to present a false image of financial health to investors. So I'm happy to have that conversation, but we'll probably take that one offline. So, okay, again, the key piece to disinformation is it's intentional. Misinformation, on the other hand, is not intentional. So we often end up passing misleading narratives because we don't understand things. So if I were to communicate to you about medical stuff, I am very likely to misinform you because I'm not somebody who's sophisticated in medical technology. I'm not a doctor. You also see it in cases like this, which is the old famous telephone game, where if you share a piece of information, by the time it gets even 2 or 3 people deep, it's completely different than what it started. Sometimes we just don't have enough information. We saw this in, for example, the opening night of the terrorist attack in Israel. We see this all the time in the news, where the news media isn't really quite sure what's happening. So there's like a moment where there's confusion, and so there's a lot of misinformation happening there. And often misinformation follows disinformation. So if I'm a malignant actor, I can push information into the atmosphere that is completely false. And other people believe me because I'm a professor at Cambridge, and so they'll share it because they trust me, and so they're misinformed. I've intentionally placed it. So it's important to know this distinction. One of my colleagues, and I highly recommend you take a look at his work, is Sander van der Linden. He is a professor of psychology. He runs a social decision-making lab at University of Cambridge, and he and I work together now on a lot of this project. He's written a book called Foolproof, which I highly recommend, which discusses some of the potential interventions, particularly pre-bunking. And sorry, I'm just making sure that I have access to the Q&A. Oh, there's more. Okay, I'll get back to the Q&A in a minute. Let me close this thought. I'll pause and answer some questions in just a second. So his book, Foolproof, in there, he has this analogy that information is like a virus, and it shares at viral rates. And there's some efficacy, or there's some validity, I guess. There's some empirical validity to that when you take a look at some of the stuff that gets shared on social media. And he's done quite a bit of that work. So I highly recommend you think about his work and take a look at that too, which is outside. We don't typically do psychology in accounting. And that's one of the reasons, again, when I come back to the curriculum of the executive master's program at Cambridge, it is so different. I can't say enough how different it is from any traditional accounting curriculum, because in most accounting curriculum, it tends to be technical, and there is some need for technical accounting, and we do go into the technical accounting, but we also humanize it and place it in the context of bigger real world questions. And we also talk about the human beings who are in the accounting domain. Okay, what research am I working on? I'll cover that later. Would you consider disinformation or misinformation if the person in green intentionally gave an incorrect message? So I'm going to go back. That's one I can answer right now. So you're saying the person in green is the disinformer. So that's the person who actively produced a false message, perhaps to take advantage of at least two of the others down chain. That person would be doing disinformation. The others would presumably be passing misinformation unless they also had incentives and were aware and were intentional of continuing it. So what we see in a lot of political environments, is we see a political actor, and this is global. This isn't unique to any particular region, but I'm politician X and I lie. I'm intentionally lying. Some of the people who believe me are passing that message along because they don't know that it's false, and I've said it and they trust me. Other people who are people in my cabal, so people who are part of my political party or my political objective, many of them probably know that it's false as well, and they'll share it too because they want to retain power. And we see this all the time in political arenas. So in most of these cases, we get co-contributors or co-collaborators on the disinformation piece, and then they probably are hitting a wide swath of people who are then sharing the information along unintentionally beyond that. So, okay, let's talk a little bit about why people fall for it. And I'm not brushing off the questions. I think it might be easier to get to some of those in a little bit. So some of the psychology, and I am not a psychologist. I'm not trained as a psychologist. I'm kind of a hobby psychologist, and I know where to talk to psychologists. And one of the reasons I assembled the Disinformation Summit, and one of the benefits, again, going back to the Cambridge Executive Masters in Accounting program, is we don't pretend, like, we're very upfront when we say our limitations of our knowledge as professors. Like I'll walk in and say, this is not my space. But immediately afterwards, I'll say, here's what I read, and here are the people who wrote it. And so what we do is we introduce those experts to the students. We'll have dinner with them. We'll bring them up on Zoom, webinars, whatever we can do. We'll videotape them. We'll get them face to face with the students if they're capable of that or able. We'll get coffee with them. So what I did was years ago, I didn't understand any of this stuff. This was one of the things that I struggled with for almost a decade. Why are people buying bullshit? I could not understand it. I mean, we are all susceptible to bullshit. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm one who is above that. Like I have bit for bad data all the time. I've bit on conspiracy theories before. So every human being is susceptible to bad information. But some people don't even want to try to vet it. And I couldn't understand why. So there are at least two reasons in the literature that suggest why. And one of them is anxiety. Every single person has some anxiety. I think it's because we're animals inherently. And there's like a fight or flight, basic instinctual anxiety. Most of us can kind of work through the anxiety, but it gets triggered in certain cases and it gets too big for each one of us. And, during a COVID infection or a COVID catastrophic global crisis where we really don't know how it spread and we really don't know where it came from and we really don't like all of that chaotic stuff will trigger fear and anxiety. We'll see this in natural disasters. We'll see this in other scenarios. And what happens is apparently our minds are wired to craft simple stories to try to explain it. So we immediately adapt stories and we say, well, maybe it's this, or maybe it's that, or maybe this is the reason. And our minds just make up stories. And they're simple, they're typically incomplete, they typically aren't, they don't have any sense of the huge big picture, and they're usually misinformed, the stories we tell ourselves. But at the same time, we also get super anxious, apparently. And so in come what we call the strong man or the strong people, the bluster people, I call them. And they will often come in and they'll appear as though they understand what's going on. And they'll say, well, I actually know truth. And they look courageous, they look intelligent, and people like to hear the stories. And so there's a lot of that happening in the world. And in fact, grifters often look for people who are anxious, and then they come in with a false bravado and they come with false stories. And people will say, oh, this guy or this woman or this person knows so much, and they glom onto them. And that's one of the main reasons. The second reason is social identity. This has been an interesting rabbit hole for me in study space. I've actually gone and taken a look at a lot of research on the social identity piece. I've been trying to understand it. I will not say that I fully understand it, but I've been doing a lot of conversations with people who've studied this piece for their entire careers. And if I characterize it pretty simply, apparently there are social psychological and even anthropological theories about why we need to feel like we belong to an in-group and why we need external validation of self. I like when you like me. I want to be part of your group. And not only do I want to be part of your group, I want to be super respected by you. And every time you give me more status and more labels, I feel better. And there's this notion about getting this external validation that allows us to feel like we'll stay with the group. It builds loyalty. And I saw this in evidence in the cryptocurrency space with crypto influencers. And I wrote a paper about that, leveraging some of the literature. And also, I see this in the political arena where we have sort of political belief structures. And again, I show, some of the Trump political followers, but I've seen this in other groups, left wing, right wings. Like it's not unique to this particular category. So I'm not making a political statement with this photograph here. It's just illustrative. So these two things are really, really powerful. I will say too that the literature suggests, I've seen literature that suggests that when we are excommunicated from a group that we care about, it triggers the same neurological pathways as physical pain. And so from what I've read, at least one study suggests that we incur what is fundamentally physical pain when we're kicked out of an in-group. Also, the anthropologists suggest that we stay with groups in part due to our deep, deep history, where if we were excommunicated, we would likely die because we couldn't live alone. And you need like a community in order to survive. That's at least one of the theories. So I'm gonna give you like a minute and a half from Todd Helmus. That'll give me a chance to read your questions. Todd is a senior behavioral scientist at Rand Corporation. Among other things, he studies terrorist groups. And he was one of the speakers at our 2023 summit. And this is about 90 seconds. If you don't hear the sound, then let me know, please. But it should work.
So there's these tactics that you can use to disseminate content. But the other side is just this role of community. And if you look at how extremist groups operate, whether they're Al-Qaeda, whether they're ISIS, whether they're January 6th movement, community is really an inherent part of that process. So you can receive information. But the real value in propaganda is reinforcing adoption of that information, reinforcing people who share that information, embracing people as a reward for people who share and adopt those views. That's what you get on these Facebook groups that were really fundamental to inspiring January 6th. It wasn't just people by themselves hearing information. It was this community that was self-reinforcing. And we've known for a long time that the way Al-Qaeda and ISIS radicalize, nobody radicalizes by themselves. They always radicalize in communities. And so you see this same process. So when I think about fixes, yes, you need to stop the dissemination of the information. But you also need to address this need for community that people have. And for people who are in those communities, you need to provide them some adequate way out, some reinforcing way out so they have something to go to. There's an open arm to go to. And I think that's the fundamental policy challenge.
So what's interesting about his comment, and it piggybacks on Diane Benscoter, who is another speaker at the summits. Diane has an interesting history. She was in a cult, and then she found her way out of the cult, and then she became what was technically called a cult deprogrammer, and even went to prison for kidnapping in trying to intervene with somebody who was in a cult, in a particular religious cult in the 80s, I think. She said fundamentally the same thing. She said it's really about community, and it's not really about facts. Like when you introduce facts to somebody who's in one of these entrenched belief systems, they don't care. If you threaten their communal position, that's really what the harm is to them. So they don't see it. They don't want to hear it. They can't really process it. And so both of these two speakers had come up with this notion, and I've seen it elsewhere, that the best way to reach people is with empathy. And what's interesting is that it's the exact opposite when you see polarized societies. And I'm, originally from the United States. There's a hyperpolarization over there, or it's happening elsewhere in the world as well. A lot of the reaction is, well, I simply don't want to talk to other people because I can't. And in fact, today is Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving if you're in the United States. And in the United States, one of the things that's happening right now is people are like, I don't want to go home. I don't want to talk to my parents. I don't want to talk to my cousins. I just don't want to talk to them. And what's fascinating about is these two would say, no, that's the exact wrong approach. The right approach would be to actually go in and sit down and try to find something communal, because it's really about a community, and it's about giving them an alternative framing so that you can reconnect emotionally, and you can give them an alternative community, and then maybe they'll hear you.
So
okay, so how do they do it? So that's why they do it. And to be clear, I'm going through kind of quickly, and it's sort of a surface level, but it gives you some understanding of where to begin thinking about it. How do they do this? This is an influencer, and there's this notion from an INSEAD professor, and I have his name. I should have listed it here, but I don't have it in front of me. An INSEAD professor coined this term pseudo-intimacy. Now, to be clear, I don't think she's doing any disinformation, so I am not accusing her of doing disinformation, but I want you to take close attention to how she engages her audience to influence them.
Hi guys! I am just gonna get right into it. This is a very requested YouTube video. This is how to become an influencer slash how to grow a following. I'm gonna tell you literally everything that I did to grow my following from 30K to 8.3 million followers in 2 years. Also, in no part of this video am I trying to come across as like, I know what I'm, like, I have this many followers, like, I know what I'm doing, listen to me. No, I'm not trying to do that. I'm literally just trying to be helpful, and I'm talking to you like we're on FaceTime. I'm gonna tell you everything that I did. No gatekeeping allowed from the very start to the very.
Oops, didn't mean to slip back. Okay, but we watched enough. The whole point of this, and this is something that was really fascinating, is the science around the communication through the vehicles, through the technology that we have. TikTok, particularly, if you pay attention to most TikTok influencers, the camera is right in the face. The environment is typically a bedroom or a sofa. Like it's almost as if they're creating an image like they are your friend. And there's a familiarity and there's a calmness. And notice her dress, her clothing is like super casual. And she's staring right at the camera and she's pointing right at you. So I'm talking right to you at this moment. I want to help you. And particularly with the younger generation, much like in reality television, there's the frequency and the time in which this happens, and then add to it that there was a whole window of severe loneliness during COVID lockdowns. This created like an intimate relationship with a complete stranger, and this is how they influence. To be clear, not all of them are harmful, but it's just being aware of the tactics that are being deployed in order to bring your guard down, feel like you're talking to a friend, and earn trust with somebody you have never ever met before. It's just a very interesting technique to pay attention
Hi guys.
to. And so another way that they do it is through cognitive dissonance. This is a very common tactic. Particularly, I see this now in aggressive politics, and this is actually as it's deployed in an accounting fraud. I'm going to introduce you to Sam Antar. He is by far one of the most interesting and provocative speakers I've had. I've had him for 20 years since I introduced him to my MBA classroom at Stanford. Sam is most known for being the architect of the Crazy Eddie fraud, which was a United States securities fraud back in the 1980s. Among other things, Crazy Eddie was an electronics discounter. At that time, they were selling, primarily radios and televisions, and portable music players. They started with cash sales. They skimmed the sales tax. They were doing money laundering. They wanted to amplify the payoff, and so they ended up. It's a long story, but they ended up bringing money back that they had stolen earlier. So if they would ferry cash over to Tel Aviv banks, then they would wire the money back in, pretend that that was revenue, and then they ended up going public, and they were exposed when they lost a hostile takeover. They tried themselves to take the company private, but the buyer actually succeeded in buying and outbid them for their own company, and then they exposed the fraud. What's important about this is sort of this particular comment. And before I let him say the comment, I want to say that there's this thing called cognitive dissonance, which is where our reality and our expectations don't match. And we sort of are like trying to reconcile two conflicting thoughts at the same time. And this happens very frequently when we live a particular lifestyle that we expect others to live. So if I expect you to be ethical in my house and you're not, that causes me a lot of like struggle. And there's this window where we have to process disbelief. Like, wait, that person, I've known this person for years. That's not possible. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. There's no possible way they did that. And there's all this rationalization that typically happens. And cognitive dissonance is typically a moment where you freeze and or you get a lot of agitation and confusion, and your mind is stuck in the processing loops while the other party is active. And so it's a momentary pause, if you will, on your actions. And so this is what Sam says.
Those ethics classes that you learn teach you to become more moral human beings. Also, they teach you about, in some ways, about what's ethical behavior, not ethical behavior, but ethics in of itself. okay, limits your behavior as human beings. Morality limits your behavior. We have laws to regulate human behavior. But those ethics that you learn in class, those codes, those social norms, they don't apply to me. I consider those weaknesses because you have to abide by a certain set of laws that I don't have to abide by. So I always have the initiative to commit my crimes.
So the whole point of this is that they're willing to do things you aren't, and they will go to any lengths to commit their crime, and you can't even get your head around it. I'll give you an example. I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine, and I'm like, yeah, here's what I think politician X is going to do, because we were talking about geopolitics. And the reaction was like complete disbelief. And they were like, they can't do that. And I go, why can't they? Because it's against the law. So their mind limited the scope of actions to where the law allows the boundary, because that's how they live. And I'm like, you don't understand that this person not only is capable of breaking the law, but wants to break the law. And the fact that you can't get your head around that is exactly how they're going to manipulate you, because you will not be prepared for them doing it, because you can't fathom they're doing it. In other words, you have no defenses prepared for that, because you can't even process mentally that they're capable of it or willing to go there. So this sounds terrible, but some of the classes that I teach include, how depraved can somebody be? When we were doing, I didn't mention this, but I have a history, also a career. I did 10 years as a military pilot in the United States, and we used to do combat flight planning, and we would have to sit there and say, okay, what are the worst case scenarios? Like, what are people willing to do in order to come after us? And that's the only way that you can plan for it, is to think through all of the depraved scenarios. And so the cognitive dissonance is also a very active weapon in some of these. So what are the risks? So disinformation, we typically think of lying in a localized contract setting. Like if you lie to me on a car deal, I'm hurt. And that's it, and it's localized. But there's super systemic risks to allowing for systemic type of disinformation to flourish. And right now we're in a free speech rights world. And in my mind, we need to be in an accountable free speech rights world. So I am by all means extremely pro free speech, but there are harms often that accumulate from free speech. For example, if we allowed Bernie Madoff to have unfettered free speech, then many, 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 many more people would have lost all of their life savings. So we can't necessarily just allow free speech unless we have accountability for harmful speech, and particularly intentionally harmful speech, to the degree that we can assess the intention. And so I think, and if you look at all of our accounting frameworks, we work in accountable free speech. You are allowed to say the financial health of a company, but you have to follow financial reporting standards. You have to get audited. We have audit committees. We have regulators, on and on and on. So we have an accountable free speech system, at least for our field. And so I think we have to think a little bit about what are the risks if we allow for complete blatant lies. Coronavirus was an example where we had a lot of misinformation. People were just confused and they didn't know what was right, including some of our healthcare providers and some of our politicians. I think we also have evidence of disinformation where people were exploiting the confusion. All of it kind of commingled. And then as a result, we had complete systemic breakdowns around the world. The economy broke down. People weren't going to work. People were trapped on ships. We had supply chain disruption, et cetera. So that's just an example of where bad information can meander off and give us systemic risks. Another one that's happening currently is we have a lot of blatant attempts, communication going out to literally undermine the entire judicial and enforcement infrastructure. So we have a lot of false information going out there to try to threaten judges. We have a lot of information going out there to make it much, much harder for our enforcement staff to deploy enforcement tools and things like that. And so if we think in terms of what's the world look like for us if we don't have viable enforcement infrastructure, that's a pretty scary world. First of all, just mathematically, our costs of capital go through the roof without any kind of infrastructure to say, hey, there's a little bit of security that person X is communicating honestly in this marketplace. So, if you don't trust the enforcement mechanisms, then you have to do a hell of a lot more due diligence before you invest. And also, you might even have to create your own enforcement infrastructure because the government's not there for you. When I go into the accountability speech discussion versus the pure free speech discussion, some of the discussions I have are whether there is such a thing as pure free speech without accountability. Because if you take it to some degree and if you play out a game, at some point in the game, you probably get a harmed party who moves into their own accountability structure of vigilantism. So just to give you some idea of where some of the discussions are happening, and I'm not going to suggest that I'm an expert on vigilantism or that that's a viable accountability infrastructure, but I can imagine a scenario where if we no longer have a Securities and Exchange Commission, by the way, that is under threat, that organization. If we no longer have market regulators, if we no longer have people holding governments accountable, then it comes back to the people and whether they're going to do something about it. And this is where you get all kinds of, really, really scary outcomes with vigilantism, with riots and all this kind of stuff. So I think it's in our best interest. And one of the things that we talk about, again, when we talk about, why do we have a need for an executive master's around accounting is we've evolved for a reason into viable accountability infrastructure and cleaner speech, because society gets into all these weird gray areas without them. On that note, it's also meanders. Some of the biggest disinformers are also some of the biggest corrupt actors. So fraud and power go together. And there are these books that I highly recommend that relate to autocratic governments. And one of the framings that I'm finding quite compelling right now is this notion that some of the authoritarian governments actually aren't really governments. They're basically enterprises of criminal syndicates. And I give credit to this gentleman, Moises Naim, who wrote this article in 2012 called Mafia States to give me this notion that, in fact, a lot of leaders of nation states are, if you look at them carefully, basically mob bosses, and they're the heads of organized transnational organized crime rings. And what they've done is they've somehow co-opted enough of the infrastructure of governments that they've taken over fundamentally the government apparatus. And that allows them then to go into what Ann Applebaum talks about in Autocracy Incorporated, is to work in a conglomeration context with shared contracts with other autocrats. And so her book, which just got published recently, is fundamentally discussing the links between autocrats. And the way I would summarize her book is that you've got organized crime rings working together, many of which have intertwined with nation states, and they have to collaborate with. And some of the examples she uses are that Putin's regime is working with the North Korean regime and the Iranian, I got to be careful, the Iranian regime, or some parts of the Iranian regime in her book, and in the context of the Ukrainian conflict. And I'm just paraphrasing from her book. So, and then the tech coup, which is Maricha Schaake, who is in the Cyber Institute at Stanford and is a former Dutch member of the European Parliament. She just recently published this book and now says that a lot of the government enterprise and a lot of is all intertwined with the tech companies. So the tech companies are all intertwined with all of this as well. And Strongmen is Ruth Ben-Ghiat's work. She's a historian, and she talks about a lot, among other things, she discusses why the patterns of these dictators who take over countries and why, and a lot of it are, she does a lot on disinformation and why people believe in the disinformation. So this gives you some, bigger picture thinking about accounting fundamentally. And I will answer the questions. I'm almost done with the talk, and then I'll answer some questions. This is from the American Enterprise Institute that basically says corruption and dictatorship go together. I don't think that actually surprises anybody. But the thing that actually gets into some of the corruption, and again, this is why we need transparency and accountability and accounting. And this is why accounting is so critical, is we see all the time theft of public resources. In fact, how much money could you make if you could have first access to the treasury, the entire tax base of a country? Nationalization of private assets happens frequently in some of these dictatorships. Reallocation of assets to sycophants. In fact, I read an article, a scientific article that says that one of the first actions that often happens when there's a new dictatorship is that the quote elites who were overthrown, their assets are taken and they're reallocated to friends of the dictator. Then you get into things like bribery, laundering, and laundering usually takes resources out of the country, extortion, wealth inequality. You get the idea. So we're going to do a super quick business case study. I'm not going to make this a particularly political discussion because I don't want to make this a political discussion. I use this as a business case. So I want you to imagine that you've got a portfolio of assets in an investment pocket in the United States. So you're holding a long position on companies in the stock market in the US. It could actually be anywhere else in the world too. And you've got this notion of immigrants are, quote, poisoning the blood of the United States. So that's kind of the narrative. So that then leads to a bunch of people thinking that there needs to be mass deportation. And so then just in the practical consequence, what are the business consequences of that? To me, if I'm sitting there running my business or if I'm running my investment portfolio, I'm asking, hey, are the workers going to show up, even if they're already citizens? So if I have my citizenship, am I still afraid to go to work because I don't know if Mr. Round 'em up guy is going to allow me to stay? Like, I don't trust necessarily that they're going to be able to figure out who's here without papers and who's here with papers. So I might not even show up in the first place. Are people productive? Even if I show up for work, am I actually doing work or am I scrolling my phone? Widespread protests. Do the protests disrupt supply chain? If you look at Tel Aviv before October, they had, I think, 1 million human beings in the streets, if I recall. Think about what happens when 1 million human beings flood the streets. Like nothing moves. There's like literally no production. And so, what happens to movement on the streets? Can you even access the streets? Can you get any supplies around? Are there runs on the banks? Are people running groceries? If you remember, at least in my part of the world, during the COVID stuff, we couldn't find toilet paper anywhere. Weapons in the United States, there's like run on weapons and people grab weapons during crises. Are the protests going to be put down violently? Long-term labor supply effects, long-term economic effects, and then are there spillover risks downstream? And the answer to this is yes. There are going to be long-term labor supply, economic, and spillover, and we can literally map them out in these scenarios. And just going into this particular case study, you've got the entire construction industry in Texas and farm groups who are now saying, whoa, 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 time out. We don't want this. This is going to crush our industry. I'm almost done, and then I'll get to your comments. My recent comments, I did some talks to pension fund executives and board members. So I want you to think in terms of they own a massive swath of our economy, global economy. And I said to them, I think it's your fiduciary obligation to engage relentlessly in advocacy and lobbying to preserve democratic, regulatory, and judicial infrastructure that's coming under attack right now. So a lot of the judicial industry infrastructure in multiple countries, particularly in the United States right now, are coming under attack. And these are people who do not want to be politically active. And I said, you no longer can afford not being politically active. For time, I'm not going to show you this movie clip, but it comes from this movie War Games. It's a fun clip because basically it's a simulated, well, at the time they didn't know whether it was simulated, but it's like a nuclear war exchange. And the computer is sending off phantom nuclear missiles across, and it runs every scenario of the nuclear strategies. And at the end, it pauses and it says the only way to win the game is to not play it at all. And so what I'm trying to suggest here is, I ran that mass deportation exercise with these people, and they were all like, wow, this is going to have a big effect on our portfolio. And I said, exactly. The only way to win that game is to not play it at all. So in my mind, like, it's your fiduciary obligation to maybe stop this notion of a mass deportation and maybe move the political discussion into a more sensible way of handling immigration reform. So again, I'm not making a political statement, I'm making a business statement in that context. Coming back to the whole purpose of this, and then I will close and do questions, and I'm happy to stay late to do questions. This is why we built this program. Like, if you can see, accounting is not just numbers in a financial context for investment. Accounting literally touches the entire globe. It gets into geopolitical discussions. Geopolitics and accounting are intertwined. We have to have accountable information systems. And then it all intertwines with human beings. If we break down our accounting infrastructure and our governance infrastructure, then human beings literally die. And it's super easy to trace the pathways to where humans are killed, sometimes murdered in some scenarios. Other times there's like lack of resources getting over to them where there's real need. And then you throw in things like climate change and climate risk. Without good information, we just can't get there. So this is one of the things, I think it's one of the most urgent societal imperatives. And again, we are creating advocates to really push forward and develop and enhance transparent information systems. And finally, I'm done, and then I'll get into your questions. We're hosting another Cambridge Disinformation Summit, and we think it's urgent to discuss interventions. By interventions, we mean ways in which we can try to stem the harms of disinformation. We are not pro-censorship. Some people will accuse us of being censorship. We are not about censorship. We're about honestly trying to help the people who might be victimized, or trying to get information cleaner, or trying to find ways to hold people accountable for the harms that they do from disinformation, none of which include censorship. We've got 3 speakers who are very, we have a ton of speakers in this summit, but these 3 particularly were very involved. Nina Jankowicz was the Biden administration's czar for disinformation, but she then was dismantled and then threatened. Her life was threatened. Yoel Roth was the head of trust and safety at Twitter. And then Mr. Musk took over. They had a complete change of heart on how they were going to do trust and safety, and he left, and he then was threatened. And then Mariana Spring is the BBC's disinformation and conspiracy reporter, and they're hosting a talk. We also have 4 legislators coming over to talk about potentially legislation of disinformation interventions and spillover effects. This is sort of the level that accounting is at the University of Cambridge. So hopefully that gives you some perspective on the importance of accounting. Now I'm going to try to get to your questions. Let me see. So feel free to fire them off. We have, could greenwashing or misrepresentation in ESG be considered an example of cognitive dissonance? I would say that greenwashing is, by definition, if it's intentional, it is disinformation. Misinformation could come in, misinterpretation could come in from cognitive dissonance, so a disbelief. So cognitive dissonance is inside, and it's sort of, I'm struggling processing the information in front of me, and because I have a prior belief system, like I've lived through my own experiences, and then new data comes in, and I like freeze because I'm like, wait, this doesn't align with what I learned earlier. And so trying to process 2 pieces of information that just don't seem to match is where cognitive dissonance hits on that one. To what extent do you believe that machine learning and AI can be leveraged to combat disinformation? So AI and machine learning has been used a lot. And so it's actually a tool to create disinformation. So it creates memes, it creates a lot of language to mislead people, but it has been used quite frequently, particularly in flagging content. Now, this gets into a lot of the space that some free speech advocates are struggling with, and that they accuse as censorship. They don't like having AI flags. They don't like people, because often, like, let me say it differently. If we collected every single data point in Twitter or X, and then we started running keyword strings or whatever algorithms, we're going to have learning around what is, quote, disinformation. You can imagine quickly how hard it is to disseminate, for example, like what's sarcasm versus what's disinformation, right? So I might say something that is really sarcastic, and I have no intention of you believing it. In fact, by me making it sarcastic, you should not believe it. But it might get flagged as me saying it as a lie. And so it gets into some really difficult points of how does one actually flag something as disinformation. So the best we can do is say, well, this might be disinformation. And then it also gets into the gray area of intention. So even though I put something into the atmosphere and then it's flagged as inaccurate, so you could say, well, this is not accurate. You don't really know whether I planned to do it because I wanted to exploit something from you, or whether it was an accident, or whether it was sarcasm. So as soon as we go down these pathways, then it gets into this really great area of how powerful is AI to tease this out. And where the problem was, which I think has some credibility, is, at what point are we going to allow these flags from these coding to help determine whether I can shut you off from communicating on a platform? So here's a hypothetical. If you're a comedian and you're constantly putting sarcasm out, like there's this, I think most of you might be familiar with The Onion. The Onion is 100% sarcasm all the time. So inherently, all of their information is wrong. If that's constantly getting flagged as disinformation, in some ways that's problematic, because it's sort of a bad read on the intention. And then it also, you could argue that it violates the free speech rights of the humorist. And so this is where it gets difficult. And this is, we could go on and on that discussion, but I do think machine learning is very valuable. Where we've seen it incredibly valuable is in audits of financial reports, because there's a lot more structure and there's a lot more traditional language in there. And we've seen a lot of efficacy from some of my colleagues who've done work in pulling even like analyst conference call, the way CEOs and CFOs communicate in conference call transcripts. They've been able to, churn data, run AI algorithms, and look for flags there, and they can spot with more probability, they can spot like fraud or signals of fraud in that context. So I think you can do that. Any other questions coming at us? Feel free to fire them off. We still have, I think, about 50 people or 48 people. So, I mean, yeah, I'll stick around if there are more questions for anybody, but this just highlights some of the higher level discussion that we have in Cambridge, and particularly in the Executive Masters of Accounting program. And what we do is we bring in people who can touch on all these points. So the summit was illustrative. Like, I am by no means the expert in the room on the psychology of this stuff. So we're bringing in psychologists. I have clinical psychologists, practicing psychologists, and all that in coming into that event. What roles are your master's students doing or moving to after the program? So many of them, so our program is typically where they actually work. Let me say that differently. That didn't come out right. Most of our students are working as they enter the program, because we offer this as a part-time program. And the idea is that they can actually activate some of the learning in their roles in real time. So many of our students are coming in from professional roles where they want to engage change in the roles, and they actually take, for example, some of the data analytics skills, predictive analytics, and they bring it right back, and they immediately implement that back at work. However, we've had several career transitions. We've had, so right now we have one of our students who graduated, and he's building a startup in the United States. And so he's got founding money, and he's building a startup in a production startup. We've got another student who is still working in, I believe, the United Nations, doing refugee work, refugee support work. And one of her reasons for coming into our program was she wanted to help identify ways to strengthen the governance infrastructure around relief supplies, because they often get wasted and or stolen, as one example. We have students who are market regulators. So one of our students, I believe, is with the British Virgin Islands market regulatory infrastructure. And after he took our program, he then went and did public policy program. And so now he's looking at policy advocacy around governance in markets, just to give you an idea of some of the stuff that we do. So PhD or post-MSc research, there could be PhD opportunities. We are not a PhD, let me say it differently. The Executive Masters of Accounting is not PhD preparatory by design. It is more of a public policy / professional change / professional startup oriented project. So most people who come into our program are designed to do practice and or policy work. The PhD stuff, we do have Cambridge does have PhD entry master's programs that you could take a look at. And all of our research faculty collaborate through that. How to avoid such atmosphere misinformed, or the attraction tactic you mentioned as example, when we only feel something is wrong, but we're not aware of what's being processed in our head or background. So Mohammed, one of the reasons, if you go back and again, we'll let the slides out to you, the 6 stages or the 6 elements of disinformation, that's why I created that. Because if you feel like you're being misled, I take a look at those 6 elements and I go, okay, can I map that out? Can I deconstruct what I'm seeing? So the key is to kind of step out of the emotion at the moment and say, what am I feeling and who's this actor? Can I identify what I think their incentives are? What's the message they sent to me? What channel did they use? And did it seem weird that they chose that channel to reach me? Did I leave a trail of crumbs to get here? In other words, can I think about my own use, my own patterns? What did I do? And think about everything from card swipes. Like every time you tap your card somewhere, whether it's at a restaurant or to get through a train, you're leaving a trail of crumbs. And did they know that? Like, could they track that? Or was there something I placed online somewhere when I put a book review? So if you're on Amazon or if you're writing a restaurant review, you're leaving a trail of crumbs that they can actually use to target you. Because you say, oh, this person likes this book or this person likes this food, they can actually come to you with that. So just think in terms of what we did and why they came to us, and then also, where am I available for exploitation? Is it that I have money? Is it that I hate to say it this way, am I physically attractive? Like, is it, this is used in that context as well. Or do they need my vote? The voting context is huge. Or particularly around elections. So I go that way and I'm like, okay, this person is sending this message. I think they have these incentives. I think this is what they're trying to get from me. And then for me, the last piece is, if I allow them to get this from me, do I get something in return that I value, and what? So marketing, so this structure also works in marketing for products. So if I'm trying to sell you a phone, or if I'm trying to sell you an upgrade on a phone or whatever, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to target message you. I'm going to try to, bring you in emotionally, things like that. But then at the end of the day, you're going to get something out of it. So for me, I'm also evaluating, did I win something in the relationship, or is it all zero sum? If there's a zero sum outcome, meaning that you win and I lose, then that's at least evidence to me that it's a disinforming actor. As someone who's had personal experience with family members turning into zombies, I'm particularly interested in psychological aspects of targeted disinformation. You already mentioned some names of experts in this field who are invited to the summit. So this is Mikal, I think. Diane Benscoter, Benscoter. If you Google her, she has an organization called antidote.ngo. She has a book that you may find interesting. She's also, before you buy the book, I would recommend you watch some of her video content. She's got several videos on YouTube that might help you. Sander van der Linden has a lot of work on trying to get alternative messaging through to people, but his book is more about mass inoculation before they get entrenched, not so much about what happens after they get entrenched. So the one thing that I can say that has been very efficacious, but it takes time, is when somebody is really in one of these belief systems, that again, it's about community. So just knowing it's about community and knowing that they really have a need for community, then if you approach them there, then you can actually have conversations where you disarm them, you make them feel like you're an alternative community. So the key is to come in with empathy and to find a place where you can talk about stuff where, you share something together and you don't go in like angry. And, what happens a lot of times is, how dare you, how, you're doing the wrong thing, you're stupid. Like, this is the narrative that we often go into these conversations with. And that's just not going to help. In fact, it's reinforcing. Oh, hey, Lucinda, good to see you. Speaking of one of our graduates, how can businesses maintain ethical standards and transparency in their financial reporting under reduced regulations? And what measures can be implemented to protect consumers and retail investors from potential risks of misrepresentation or disinformation? So Lucinda asked a good question about what happens when the market enforcement infrastructure disintegrates. This is new territory to some degree, but it does get into some of the academic research in our space where you can communicate independently that you're of a higher type. And we've seen this in the literature in different contexts. So there are other ways to do it. And we're moving into, where private enterprise decides that they're going to be sort of a pseudo regulatory. So even if, for example, we go to the hypothetical where the exchange regulators are shut down because some, political pressure, it doesn't mean, what you could do is you could set up an alternative exchange, or you could have a private entity that comes in and says, hey, we're going to be ethical and we're going to make a pact to be ethical. And so we're going to be an ethical community. We're going to create our own norms and we're going to publish those norms and we're going to ask people to volunteer into those norms. And then we're going to create our own system. And you see this, for example, I think a good example is PRI, which is Principles for Responsible Investment, where they have a lot of volunteer signatories. That's another example. Also, you get examples where the choice of the exchange that companies will list on and their exchange reporting requirements. So the New York Stock Exchange, the American Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, they all have rules, and they all have rules that are in some cases above and beyond those of the regulators. And so there are ways that you can decide that you're going to be a better type. And so what I am expecting is, if we continue down a path, particularly in the United States, which I think is very highly likely, that we're going to see the disintegration of reliability in the market enforcement infrastructure. I sense the current or the upcoming political clout group, they do not want regulatory interface. Like, they just do not want enforcement of any of their stuff. I have hypotheses about why they don't want enforcement. I think some of the analogs to mafia states might be in play, but I don't have enough evidence to make that claim fully. But my suspicion is that there is a reason they don't want market enforcement of crypto. They don't want market enforcement around themselves. And if that's the case, then what I would expect to see is, I expect to see other entities saying, you know what, we're going to be good anyway, and here's how. And so we're going to be transparent, even though we're not required to be transparent. And we're going to do it because we want to build trust with people. So I expect to see independence around that, as long as they're able to do that. Anonymous, given the point that some view ethics as weakness, do you have a Cliff Note business case you would use to pitch the course to companies to co-fund? To pitch the course, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I think what you're asking is, how do you spy the companies that are trying to work the end around, and how do you avoid them? I'm not sure what that question's after. So maybe if you could reword that, that would help. Are there any other questions? I know we're getting a little bit over time, but I'm happy to stay a little bit longer. We still have 44 people, so I can easily stick around. Are there any in the chat? I haven't been looking at the chat. Oh, okay. So I'm happy to talk more about this. I think, just to give you some perspective, the anonymous came back. I'll just finish my thought and then I'll go to what you wrote. I think it's pretty important. What you can see from Cambridge, what we do and the way that I operate is, the Disinformation Summit arose because I was curious. I sat during the pandemic and I was just trying to understand what's going on, because I'm like, why aren't people looking for more answers? And also, why aren't people looking to prior experience? So what struck me as completely insane and irrational was that, countries in Europe could have easily looked to countries in Asia for guidance on what to do about the pandemic, because there was experience learning that they just could have embraced. And yet I found countries in some of the other regions, like because of politics or something, completely like tuning it out. And it just didn't make any sense to me. And then some sensible stuff. So I think how we handled the pandemic in most countries was way wrong in my mind. But I won't go into the politics of or my belief systems, but I think there were much more sensible ways to do it. But I say that because I was the one reading, I consumed so much research on what was happening because I didn't know what the answers were. And so I was curious. The whole point of it is that like when I saw people going completely outside the system or what I would do, it's not that I was judging them. I was like curious. So it led me to want to learn more about what was going on. And so what I was trying to get an idea of was to bring in the people who would actually know. And so what I did was I said, okay, would you be willing to come to Cambridge? And almost everybody says yes, because it's an incredibly beautiful place. And I was like, can we talk about this and can we learn from each other on this? Okay, so you're saying if company I work for sees ethics as a weakness, how do I get them to support me and pay? Oh, I see. Okay. So yeah, so in some companies, so we do get some companies who will sponsor their students, and we obviously would encourage that if they're willing to do that, and we're happy to even have conversations with some of the company management just to kind of illustrate the value benefit. I think the key is for us to clarify when we talk or when you talk to the companies, and we can help you with what to communicate. Like, here's what we deliver, and here's the kind of training that you're able to get. And our students who've gone through the program are also incredibly useful for that conversation. And then more importantly, here's exactly how it can benefit your bosses and your enterprise now. Again, many of our students have actually been able to implement immediately some of the learning that we're giving them, and many have experimented around that. And in some contexts, it's with change management. We have a change management course, and that is a practical oriented course, which includes sometimes like a change management infrastructure that you build. So if there's a particular change design that you want to do, this helps you map it out and get a lot of input on that as one example. Alternatively, again, the predictive analytics is a toolkit that some people have found incredibly important and useful to do some analysis at work, things like that. We also do a human interpersonal dynamics course that I help co-facilitate, and that will help you better understand resistance and things like that. And so there are ways in which you can communicate to them about the value add. Is there a pathway from this program to CPA? This is so yes and no. This is not designed specifically for CPA preparation. Some of the stuff you learn will help undoubtedly with the CPA preparation, but many, and if we don't, you do not need to be certified to be in this course. This isn't about accounting in a very narrow construct. This is about information and financial information in many cases, but it's more about information quality, information policy, including the accounting profession. And so you can leverage a lot of what we teach, including some of the technical stuff for CPA certification, but this is not, you're not going to be able to walk out of this and go, okay, I'm ready to take the examinations, et cetera. We're not built that way. There are other programs that do that, but we think that those are limiting. We think we can answer broader questions, if that makes sense. So they're not, it could be helpful, but it's not designed specifically for that pathway. I think with that, okay, I'll do one more question, then we'll kind of wrap up. In what ways can AI enhance governance and infrastructure within your executive program on global market trading and policies? I think one of the biggest ways AI helps is in identification, much faster identification of potential problems before they get exacerbated. I could see that, for example, if you're concerned about like a bank run. We had the Silicon Valley Bank issue. So you can run analysis and do predictive. So I'll give you a very specific example. Some of the Silicon Valley Bank stuff was because of communication. I'm not going to say disinformation. It's communication on Twitter and X and other platforms. So it wasn't disinforming. It was sort of alarming. There was a several large players, people who were really, really reputable, who went out on social media and said, "Uh-oh, you better think about your bank." And they're not lying. Like in that case, it was like, hey, there may be problems with the bank. That information can get quickly spun up, and there are AI algorithms. There's companies, and I won't mention the names, who are monitoring real-time sentiment using AI, and they're picking up all of the feeds around specific key terms. So you can get in and type in a key term and you can monitor. And so you can get immediately very fast reporting that there's like energy, like there's social media energy around Alan Jagolinzer today, or there's social media energy around, Taylor Swift today. There's social media energy around Silicon Valley Bank today. And even that could be an incredibly helpful governance tool to just understand that there's energy. And it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that a lot of people are buzzing on it. And then you can kind of penetrate deeper and go, okay, well, what's happening? And do I need to act? And it gives you more speed to act. I think at this point, I'm probably going to have to close because we are of at least 15 minutes over. I very much encourage you, if any of this interests you and you want to explore what we're doing, please reach out to our team. We are very communicative, like by design. I can't stress this enough. Like our program is built for community. Everything we do is collaborative. Faculty, staff, we consider everybody part of the community. We're very open. We want to have conversations. We do not want to waste people's money ever. We want to know that you will value the learning and that we can help you with the learning. And we also want to help guide you into whatever career path outcomes or whatever project outcomes that you want to do. I have a lot of interest in supporting the work our students do, not because of money, but because of just sort of like the emotional energy they put into it. Like people come to us because they actually want to change things and they want to make society better and they want to create incredibly cool projects or incredibly cool businesses, or they want to change how their governments are operating and things like that. So I'm all in on that stuff. I think it's exciting. I think it's fun. And it is absolutely truly global organically. We do not sit there and say, hey, we need to find students from Brazil or whatever. They just naturally come to us. So our student cohorts are totally global by design. And so you will have, as a student with us, colleagues from literally everywhere. But in order to have more learning, we have taster days where you can come visit us in class and sit through the class and talk to our students. And we have interviews and we have casual interviews, and our head of program, Dr. Mike Willis, will meet you for coffee if you're in London, for example, and he often goes to other cities to meet students or candidates, I should say, and things like that. So please reach out if you're interested. And there's a sign up sheet on the website. You can also just email any of us and we can support you. Also connect on LinkedIn too. We have a LinkedIn page for that too. So with that, I'm going to close, and I appreciate everybody staying this long. If you have questions, you can also fire them off to me. I'm available to chat more about this. We also have a Cambridge Disinformation Summit LinkedIn page, and I put a lot of research up there, a lot of current event topics up there. It is open for discussion. I don't endorse like people who post there. We have several people posting there. We do not endorse the stuff we post. We place it there because they're interesting and it allows for discussion. And I will say that we have over 11,000 and growing daily people who are all over the world working from all kinds of angles on information who, these folks are actually, writing in comments and sending us information. And so the idea, again, is we're building a community of people to have discussions around this. We don't ever pretend we're the experts on the topic. We open up the dialogue, and that's how we all learn. And that's the whole point of our project. The best way to contact me specifically, I'm probably LinkedIn would be the easiest way to get to me. I have email. It's online. If you Google my last name, you can see my last name spelled there. I'll let you read it because it's a lot easier to just read it. You'll find me there. Oh, there it is. It's in the chat. So Aiden was able to put in the chat there. So you can reach out to me there easily. And that also will allow me to get you to the Disinformation Summit page too, if you're interested in that as well. With that, I'm going to close. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Feel free to ask for questions later, and I appreciate the time and I appreciate your interest in this space. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. And if you're in the United States, happy Thanksgiving.